And let me just share my screen here. So as you all know, today's webinar is just a quick update on financial incentives for smoking. And Grant kindly looked over these slides for me yesterday and did highlight that there are a number of statistical bits and pieces throughout this, which I'm going to try and explain to you as I go through, but I don't want you to get bound up in the statistics, but instead just try and take the top level key messages from this. So in terms of personal financial incentives, so whether that be paying people in cash or using vouchers, they've been used for some time in a range of different areas. So for example, helping people get vaccinated, attend screening appointments, and also adhering to treatment. So there's some evidence that they can be useful for smoking cessation, weight management. But one of the questions I often hear from people is, yeah, but will they really last that long? I.e., once you stop paying people to do the behaviour you want them to do they go back to their old behaviours? So I'm just going to start off here. Now, this is just a summary, and here already you can see a whole lot of ORs, which are odds ratios. I don't want you to worry too much about those, but look at the coloured boxes. So if the box is orange, it means it's effective for that particular behaviour change, and blue, it may show some effect, but it may not be effective. Those who know about...
Sorry, Hayden, what is a CI? 95% CI.
The 95% CI is the 95% confidence interval. So this says that we can be 95% sure that the real odds ratio in this case, OR, lies somewhere between a lower range and an upper range. Now, if an odds ratio is 1, then it means there's no effect. Okay, so we take smoking cessation here, and we can see at 6 months giving incentives versus not giving incentives as an OR of 1.8. So that's the odds of quitting smoking 1.8 times the odds of quitting smoking without an incentive. What you're looking at is outside of the study that the real odds ratio, or we can be 95% sure that the real odds ratio lies somewhere between 1.37 and 2.37. Okay, so this doesn't cross 1, it's all above 1, so we know that this is statistically significant. Okay, so you'll see this as we go through. The blue ones you can see here all cross 1, so that's why we're saying that not statistically significant. So, just going back to smoking cessation, this is where we have the strongest evidence, because you can see here, even out to 12 to 18 months, you're still seeing an effect of a financial incentive. So how
go on to manage participants and mute those people. Sorry.
Now, what people worry about, as I mentioned earlier, that actually after you remove the incentive, do people relapse? And here you're seeing here that the smoking cessation at least, removal of the incentive 2 to 3 months earlier, you're still seeing an effect of the incentive over not providing an incentive. But further out, you're seeing this drop off. Now I'm going to show you some more up-to-date evidence here, but bottom line is that financial incentives do help people stop smoking, even once the financial incentives have stopped.
Okay.
Now, I'm going to present some more.
Sorry, can you just get a bit closer to the microphone? Your sound is dipping in and out. It's pretty hard to hear from my end. I'm not sure how others are going, if that's possible.
Yeah, no problem. So I'm going to present some data here from the very recently published Cochrane Review on Financial Incentives for Smoking Cessation. And this is what they conclude, that there's high certainty evidence. So we're quite certain of the evidence here that incentives improve smoking cessation rates at long-term follow-up in mixed population studies. So this includes people with substance abuse, women who are pregnant, and just in a general population. In terms of the long-term or sustained effect of the incentive, they say the effectiveness does appear to be sustained when the last follow-up occurs after withdrawal of incentives. Okay, so not only is it effective, there's high certainty of evidence that there is evidence that incentives are effective in the long term.
Is that specifically for smoking cessation, or is that across a range of health?
This here we're talking specifically about smoking cessation.
Okay.
Now, in this Cochrane review, there were a range of different studies. Most offered either cash or vouchers for abstinence, for use prize draw alongside some sort of personal reward. Two studies used self-deposited money. So this is where you'd recruit people and you'd say, okay, give me $100, I'll hold this and you'll get it back if you don't smoke. And four used the combination. So most are talking about incentives offered for contingent on abstinence. So if you quit smoking, you get the reward. If we just look at the effect of incentives after payment ceases, okay? So here we have the effectiveness of blue bars are incentive, red bars are no incentive. And you're looking at smoking cessation rates. I've got the absolute rates here at 6 months or longer. And this is looking at incentives provided right up until the longest follow-up. So for example, if you provided incentives up to 12 weeks, then and measured abstinence, this would be in this arm. And this here, this analysis here is looking at incentives that weren't provided at longest follow-up. So you stopped the incentive before you did the longest follow-up. That makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what's your take on these slides when you say looking at these? Do you say which of these procedures would I follow for best results?
Well, you can see if you keep on providing incentives right to the very end, you get a slightly bigger effect in long-term abstinence rates than if you, let's say, only provide incentives to 4 weeks and follow people up for 6 months. However, having said that, and what's important is this effect size here is still significant. So even providing incentives for a short time, but following up people in the term, still see an effect of financial incentives. Okay, so when people tell you, oh yes, but incentives only work for as long as you provide them, you can tell them they're wrong and they could look at the systematic review which tells them otherwise.
Right, that's interesting.
Okay, now I'm just going to show you some data here on substance use. So these are people that might be misusing drugs or alcohol, and you're helping them to stop smoking. Now, overall, you can see that those with substance misuse, although the quit rates are higher, this difference between incentives and non-incentives was not significant. Okay, so overall that difference was not significant. You did see a significant difference in people that didn't use substances. So what you're seeing here is that people that use other substances and smoke are typically the more highly dependent smokers and find quitting more difficult. Now, that doesn't mean to say that financial incentives are definitely not helpful in this group. There are relatively smaller number of studies of substance misusers and financial incentives. So watch this space as well. Now, in terms of pregnant women, and I know most services are providing some financial incentives for pregnant women, here you can see a very strong effect of providing financial incentives. So big effect size here, i.e. those that got incentives were significantly more likely to quit, over double long-term quit rates than those that didn't get incentives. And this is at longest follow-up, which would be postpartum. And this is showing you at the end of pregnancy. So almost a threefold increase in quit rates. So the data here are strengthening for financial incentives for pregnant women. Now, does size matter? Does the amount of incentive make any difference? Well, these data are from a systematic review in 2015, which divided incentives into high, so greater than 400 US dollars versus low, less than 400 US dollars, and found that actually there was no difference in high or low incentive terms of quit rates. So they're suggesting size doesn't matter. I know when I looked at these data before, I thought, well, that was quite a high cutoff, 400 US dollars. That's pretty high in New Zealand dollars there. So I wondered if the cutoff might have changed that. But the Cochrane review of 2019 showed absolutely no effect of the amount of incentive on outcome either. And this graph is just showing you the relationship. And even low to moderate value incentives are adequate. Now you might say, well, what is a low to moderate value incentive? Well, that's going to depend on the population. If you're looking at low-income countries, a really small value incentive could still be moderate. In high-income countries, you're probably going to have to pay a little bit more for it to be low or moderate value. But it does mean, I think, that you don't need to go and pay huge amounts of money to support people to quit smoking. So those of you that have a limited budget, it might be wise to have a look and see maybe whether you can reduce things a little bit or maybe stretch it out for longer. The type of reward. So this is looking at smoking cessation in pregnant women, and this is looking at quit rates here by whether you said, okay, you'll get a guaranteed reward no matter whether you're smoking or not. And then the other bar there you can see is the reward is contingent on not smoking. And obviously, if you put all your rewards contingent on being abstinent, then you're going to get a bigger effect than just paying people regardless of whether they're quitting smoking or not. Seems obvious, and why would you pay people? There are some studies that have looked at just paying people to turn up or paying people for carbon monoxide monitoring. But I think the key thing here is rewarding people contingent on their behavior. Now, some studies looking at financial incentives look at loss aversion. Now, loss aversion may be a stronger driver for behavior change than rewarding people for positive behavior. So loss aversion is where you might have some money. Let's say you've stopped smoking for 2 weeks, and each week you're given $50, but you don't get it all. You put it into a virtual bank account, and so week 2 you've got $100 in the bank, but week 3 you slip, and you might have a rule of the game that says actually if you slip you lose whatever money you've got. Actually, that aversion to loss is a stronger driver of remaining abstinent than getting the extra $50. So when you're thinking about incentive programs, it may be wise to think a little bit like playing some sort of video game almost, where something happens, you lose your life. Something happens, you maybe slip, and you might lose a proportion of money. But a better way of even doing that still would be saying, well, look, you've lost $50, but don't worry, because if you can get back on track within the next week, you'll go back to where you were before. So there's loss aversion, but also trying to get people back on track with that promise of money back. The deposit refund approach, I mentioned at the beginning that a couple of papers looked at people paying their own money and they got that back if they weren't smoking. The problem with these studies, and you can imagine this, is that they have really low rates of uptake. Many whānau are going to want to give you their hard-earned cash. But if you do have people that do sign up to these sort of things and contribute their own money, they can get equally as high quit rates, or even higher than reward-only participants, so just giving out a reward. So it's not that you shouldn't do this, you could do it, but it'll be probably the people that we're working with are not going to have the money to start with to give you to hold on to. What else? Back to 2015 review, financial incentives might be more important for people from lower socioeconomic groups. And this review concluded that incentive schemes may help reduce health inequalities. I think this is definitely something we should be looking at within stop smoking services. And I just wanted to show you a study. This is giving big incentives to low income smokers. And this study had quite good effects. It was undertaken in Switzerland. It's a randomized control trial where people either got financial incentives. You can see here in that table the schedule of payments, and I've converted them to New Zealand dollars there. So over a 6-month period, they could earn up to $2,360. So quite a large sum of money. These were also supermarket vouchers. And here, actually, if a participant missed the visit or smoked, then the value of their next reward was reset to the value of the previous award. So there's a little bit of loss aversion here within this trial. But you didn't quite lose the money that you've already earned.
Sorry, Hayden, can I just ask a question there on the previous slide? So the total there, as you say, it's quite large. If services in New Zealand were replicating this, is the cost of incentivising people to stop smoking less than the cost of them continuing to smoke to society as a whole?
Well, to the society as a whole, it pretty much works out even because the amount of money that the government gets from tax revenue is quite high these days. So when you look at governmental income, it's really high. I guess what you might be asking here, though, is about, is this something that stop smoking services could afford? Well, this particular program was a web-based stop smoking program. People just came in to see people to do their CO validation and get their vouchers if they hadn't smoked. So they're really taking away sort of the face-to-face component and using a web-based program. So one might argue that this is actually pretty cost-effective if you think about how much time a person costs over a 6-month period. And you might also think about, well, actually, what were the long-term quit rates? And if you just look at the 3-month quit rates here, you can see quite a marked difference in quit rates between the two groups. And this is a web-based program, although these are just 7-day point prevalence, not continuous abstinence. Here is the end of incentive at 6 months, and you can see how there is a drop-off in abstinence or in quitting in the incentive group. But even so, the 12 months, not a single puff over a 12-month period, up to 18 months after the quit period, there was still a significant difference between the two groups. And almost 10 versus 5% continuous abstinence rates at 18-month follow-up is pretty good.
Okay.
So you might still be subject to concerns, and especially people that don't know the area very well, they might say, well, does this help long term? I think the evidence is strengthening. The data from this Cochrane review really shows that there is long-term effect of financial incentives. The data also show that these are a cost-effective way to help people quit. Do people game the system? I haven't talked about this, but people would get worried, well, what if you get non-smokers turning up to take part? Well, that's why we do CO breath testing. And you really want to make sure that you're starting with people who smoke. In some of the studies that were a little bit more lax on this, they did find that some people were enrolling in these programs that weren't smoking. So it's something to be aware of. and something that we do need to make sure that we test people for. In terms of social or political acceptability, I think we've moved quite a long way from this. Even 5 years ago or so, there was perhaps a little bit more sensitivity around this, but I think it's a fairly acceptable approach, at least in the smoking cessation field.
So are you saying that people in the general community, if they hear that someone like a DHB is paying people $2,000 to stop smoking, they say that's fine, or some of them say that's a terrible waste of money?
I imagine that if they heard that people were being paid up to $2,000, I can imagine there'd be a few angry voices. But I think, we have had acceptance that paying people $100 or $500 over 12 weeks is acceptable. The thing that people forget is that the government spends lots of money on various different services that have probably limited efficacy in helping people stop smoking. So it's all about finding that right balance.
Okay, just one more. Sorry, go on.
Go on, Grant.
Oh, just one more question on this slide. You've got in gaming, you've got cotinine testing. Can you explain that?
So cotinine is a byproduct of nicotine. It's the primary metabolite. So some studies have used cotinine testing at baseline. So that gives you an indication of exposure over the past week. We don't routinely do this in practice because it's an expensive test. But if you were really paying people lots of money, you'd probably want to make sure that they were proper smokers before enrolling them. So that's just one way of doing that.
Is that a blood test, is it?
You can do it via saliva or urine, and you can even do it with a dipstick test.
Okay.
Yeah. And my last point in this table concerns around, but it doesn't address the underlying cause of unhealthy behaviour. And a lot of these concerns are from people that don't work in behaviour change fields. And we're not saying that counselling is not an important role in all of this. It's just that incentives encourage people to stick with the program. And what we do hear from people very often is that they don't stay in it just because of the incentives. The incentives might have been important at the beginning, but the relationships or the skills they learn over time by sticking with the program are really what they're doing for. So just to finish up here, I think there's really good accumulating evidence now that financial incentives are effective for smoking cessation. There are data now to show that the effect remains even after these financial incentives stop. I think ideally still they should be coupled with, and we're in the business here, which should be continued, but we also may consider how these financial incentives may work with web-based programs or text-based programs in the future. And last point on there, do have a think about your financial incentive program and look at structuring it perhaps in different ways. You might choose to change the value of your incentive program, maybe stretch it out a little bit longer, maybe even put some gaming into it with some loss aversion. So maybe people can win and can lose, but they can get back on track as well. And that is that.
Okay, so thank you very much, Hayden. So what I'll do now is I'll unmute everyone, and if people would like to ask Hayden some questions, then we should be able to hear just a sec. Okay.
I might want to hear it again. I don't know.
Okay, I'll have for those of you who aren't listening, we're all live. So, does anybody have any questions for Hayden?
I'm actually quite good at it now, so I'll get
Okay. Have I unmuted Hayden? I'll unmute Hayden.
Yeah, unmuted.
There you go. It doesn't look like there are any questions. So thank you very much, Hayden. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Now, if some of your colleagues haven't been able to see this, remember it has been recorded, and that will be on our website probably sometime this afternoon. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next month for Hayden's webinar in September.
Okay.
Kia ora, Hayden.
See you.